The Leadership Exchange. The Leadership Perspectives. Mondays, 7 to 8 p.m. Engaging with leaders who drive change. Exploring the minds shaping our world.
Alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And yes, we are now on the Leadership Exchange. I have with me in studio a very special guest. He has been on air before. And that was giving us a bit of a lesson in the elections. So tonight we have Dr. Iqbal Survé once again. Assalamu alaikum, Doc.
Walaikum salam, Ihsan. Thank you for having me on the show.
And Doc is actually the chairman of Independent Media. He's an international businessman. He's a philanthropist. He does a lot of stuff. So, Doc, I'm not going to go. I mean, most people know who you are. So I'm not going to go into it because we don't have a lot of time tonight. And firstly, thank you for giving us your time. I know your schedule is hectic. You were supposed to be here last week, but you were entertaining some Chinese delegation.
Yes, that's right.
So my interest tonight in terms of the Leadership Exchange is that, Doc, you have been part of BRICS for a very, very long time. You need to tell us a little bit about it because you saw the potential in BRICS a long time ago. And only now we see all these countries scrambling to be part of BRICS. And of course, what inspired me to get you on air is I saw a photo of you and President Putin, President of Russia. So if you are obviously interacting at that level, then you must be quite au fait with the affairs of BRICS. So maybe tell us a little bit of the history of BRICS.
Ihsan, I think it's worth just rewinding a little bit. So the term BRIC, not BRICS but BRIC, was coined by one of the Goldman Sachs guys to describe the world's fastest growing economies.
So you mean the S wasn't in there?
The S was not in there.
Okay.
And it was Brazil, Russia, India and China that were growing at exceptional pace. And what then happened was that they had formed BRIC already. We were part of something called IBSA, India, Brazil and South Africa, which was started by Thabo Mbeki. Well, it was during his presidency that we had IBSA. So there were a number of us that were, let's call us, internationalists, and we started thinking about possibly South Africa's involvement with BRIC. And we then accompanied, then President Zuma to the BRIC conference, which was in the Chinese island near the Fujian province, where we made the case at the time for South Africa to join BRIC, and so that effectively became BRICS. But it's also worthwhile understanding that BRICS came about because in 2008 it was the financial crisis in the world, and what had happened at the time, the economies of the West all went in to support each other, and they left the economies of the global South in tatters. And so the economies of the global South, which we call the global majority, they realized that they're on their own. And then there was another grouping called the G7 grouping. And the G7 grouping excluded, the world's fastest growing economies. And even when the G20 grouping was established, the G7 still continued to exclude the big economies of the world. And that's why BRICS effectively became an alternative, if you like, to the G7. And it became an opportunity for developing and fast-growing economies in the world to actually protect themselves from another global financial crisis. And hence the establishment of BRICS, hence the establishment of the reserves, contingency reserves, hence the establishment of the new development bank, which is also called the BRICS Bank. So I've been lucky in a way to be involved from the very beginning of South Africa's involvement with BRICS.
Both lucky? Is that a good word to use? Lucky?
Well, I mean, I think it's a privilege to be involved in some of these.
I mean, you had foresight, so...
Yeah, well, I mean, I've always believed that the global South must unite. I believe that, we have a strong history and roots in the non-aligned movement. And the non-aligned movement was an important movement, not to be bound to the East or the West. And people like Mandela and others, championed during the time when they were, even before they went to prison, the non-aligned movement in the world today. So I think it was an important continuation politically, although BRICS started off as an economic entity, really to counter, as I said, the consequences of the 2008 financial crisis. It has now evolved to be far more significant into both economic and a political entity.
So, I mean, that's now, but now you, at the time when you got involved, so I know that you were heading up some forum within BRICS. Which one was that?
Yes, so I was the chairman of the BRICS Business Council. So the Business Council chairpersons are established by, the presidents of the various countries and the cabinets. So it's an official body which engages with the presidents of the BRICS countries. And in my last 2 years of office as the BRICS Business Council chairman, I was also the president and chairman of the 5 BRICS countries. So it was, at that time it was only 5 countries. Today BRICS is now what we call BRICS Plus. It is 10 countries that are members of BRICS, with Saudi having an observer status as well. And then there's now new partnerships that have just joined at the meeting in Kazan in Russia, and that's another 12 countries that will eventually become fully fledged members of BRICS countries over the next 3 years.
So why is it that Saudi's only got observer status?
Well, Saudi, what had happened is that at the BRICS conference in South Africa, Saudi applied to join BRICS. And just to recap again, BRICS was initially Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. South Africa being representative of Africa. And then at the conference in South Africa, we saw the addition of Ethiopia. We saw the addition of Egypt. We saw the addition of the UAE and Iran and Saudi Arabia, as well as Argentina.
Yes.
And when Milei became the new Argentinian president, I mean, we know that his sympathies lie to a large extent with the US. Milei decided to withdraw Argentina from BRICS. Saudi applied to be a member of BRICS and was accepted as a member of BRICS, BRICS Plus, and then subsequently were evaluating the Saudi involvement. So that one foot in, so to speak, and one foot out. But it's important to know, at the meeting in Kazan, although, MBS, the Crown Prince, could not attend the BRICS meeting in Kazan, it was attended by the Saudi foreign minister. He was, in fact, present and had the stature as a head of state, equivalent to that.
So... Okay, because for me it was strange because they're obviously a very significant power block in the world, Saudi, with the oil. But you say that will be fixed in the next session, possibly.
Yeah, look, Saudi, Iran and Saudi, people were surprised that UAE, Iran and Saudi, Egypt were all together in BRICS. These, certainly at face value, they may not always be aligned on global matters, geopolitical matters as relates to the region in the Middle East. So Saudi is, he's a BRICS kind of, let's call it, observer member at the moment, but I think it's getting towards full membership. There's no question that the Saudis were lobbied extensively by the United States not to join BRICS, and that may have had an influence on them sort of putting one foot in and one foot out. But I think over time, Saudi Arabia will just take up its full membership of the BRICS grouping.
Doc, now on the issue of BRICS as a power bloc, now of course it was intended to be an economic kind of entity, but is it maybe foreseeable that the global South will look at BRICS to be a new form of a United Nations? Is that even conceivable?
I think that BRICS has in the past 12 months pivoted quite seriously in directions that no one would have foreseen. So I think it was always going to be the plan that the BRICS would be the equivalent of, let's call it the G20 for now. Mm-hmm. Many BRICS member states are members of the G20. In fact, South Africa hosts the G20 next year. Brazil hosted this year. But the conflicts, certainly in Europe in terms of Ukraine, the Russia-Ukrainian conflict, which is effectively a Russia-NATO conflict, mm-hmm. The situation in the Middle East, in particular in Palestine, in Gaza, with vis-a-vis Israel, and then the situation with Israel and, if you like, Lebanon and Iran, these geopolitical factors have actually brought the issue of security to the fore in the BRICS grouping. And one of the outcomes of the Kazan Declaration was that, one of the outcomes of the Kazan Declaration was an acceleration of security of the BRICS countries working together to actually, in terms of defending their own security. Perhaps after the break we can also talk about the financial systems impact of the Kazan Declaration.
No, that will be good. Yeah, look, that was just an introduction, Doc. We're still going to get into the meat of the substantive issues that was discussed at the latest BRICS conference. So yeah, I think we're now ready to break for Maghrib, and of course when we come back, we're going to be dealing with a whole lot of issues pertaining to BRICS. But Doc, I would like you to deal with the issue of the current usefulness of the United Nations and whether it is still a relevant organization, and of course the role of the Security Council. So yeah, that's all the issues that we will be discussing after the Maghrib Salah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yes, we are back after Maghrib, and I have with me Dr. Iqbal Survé, who is the chairman of Independent Media. He's also the chairman of Seconjalo Investment Holdings. He's also a philanthropist, a medical doctor, entrepreneur. Doc, ik kan aangaan.
Please don't.
Yeah, but anyway, Doc, so coming back to the whole issue of BRICS, or rather the conference that was held in Kazan in Russia. You had the privilege to be interacting with President Putin. Tell us a little bit about that.
President Putin is one of the most important world leaders right now. There is no question that Russia is regarded, first of all, in geopolitics as a very significant player for a number of reasons. The first is that Russia has a nuclear arsenal which is the largest in the world. Mm-hmm. So you don't mess around with a nuclear power. Nuclear power. The second point is that it is right at the interface of Western Europe and Asia, and that makes it really significant. Thirdly, its military has now just recently, in the latest military rankings, been ranked number one, with the US now number two, and followed by lots of other countries. So it's a serious player globally, and what it does, it balances the power of NATO and the United States, and that's important for all of us that live in the global South. We need a multipolar world. We need a multilateral and multipolar world. And then President Putin himself is a very, very strong man.
Leader.
Is loved by the people of Russia. And what was the most amazing thing for me coming, and especially for your listeners, which would be interesting, is that how tolerant Russian society is to Islam and Muslim religion. So, historically under the Soviet Union, we always had the view that Islam was, banned, or mosques were banned. It's not true. I discovered that myself when I went to the BRICS summit in Ufa, which is predominantly a Muslim province of Russia, and met virtually everyone from the governor, the mayor, the leadership that was Muslim, and was shocked by the number of mosques and institutions. Was shocked by the fact that during the Ramadan everyone fasts in Ufa. And then again, one found in Moscow, when I was there now, I found that there were many places serving halal food, which I'd never thought of in Russia. And the amount of respect for, and I think Putin himself, respect for Islam, and the amount of work that Putin has done in cultivating support, in particular for countries of the Middle East, to help them counter the influence of the West, if you like, and to give them very serious military support. I think says a lot for Putin's role.
Also, for Doc, I also saw that recently also opened one of the biggest masjids in Moscow.
Yes, and that's what's surprising, I would say, to actually get used to the fact. It was quite funny because one of the chauffeurs that was taking us back to the airport when I left Moscow, was Muslim, and he saw my name, Muhammad Iqbal, and he said, Assalamu alaikum, and I greeted him. And it was quite, not something you normally expect in Moscow. So I think the fact that, Putin has opened this up in a way. But, he's, Putin's a very strong leader. I was really happy to meet him in his residence in Novo-Ogoryav, which is about 30 minutes out of Moscow.
Did you go to his residence?
Yeah. That's where we actually met and had the meeting and at the engagement. Of course, I've met Putin before in my capacity as chair of the BRICS Business Council and participant also in some of the G20 meetings. But this was nice to be up close and personal at his home to discuss, some matters of interest with regard to the BRICS, to what's happening in the world today, look at, in particular, the BRICS and Africa, and how, South Africa in particular, can benefit from BRICS, but also to encourage Putin. The point which I think was widely publicized in the global media, not just in media in the BRICS countries, but even in the West, was my call to President Putin to seize what I call the Mandela moment. And I said, ultimately, what we do want is peace. We want peace in the Middle East. Innocent people are suffering. We want peace also in Ukraine and and parts of Europe. And therefore, I think it's important for President Putin, who has the power, to actually lead the peace initiative, and for him to, in a way, seize the Mandela moment. I think that that part of my discussion with President Putin, I think, shocked a lot of people, because I said to President Putin, he could be the Mandela of today's times, because Russia is in a very strong position in the world today to enforce peace. In particular, if you look at the situation in Gaza and Palestine and the Middle East as a whole. because we need peace now more than ever. Of course, we need justice along with peace.
Yeah, of course.
But I think right now we must stop the killing and the suffering of innocent people.
And also, Doctor, did he mention anything about the Ukrainian conflict that's in its death throes? Because for me, looking at the media, the alternative media, it seems like that war is coming to an end.
Yeah, there's no question that Russia was provoked by NATO in Ukraine, because the agreement after the fall of the Berlin Wall was that the new countries that were part of the Soviet Union that got their independence and that are next to Russia would not deploy nuclear weapons or hostile weapons against the Russian state. And that was to be frank, the kind of agreement that saw Russia emerge and integrate in particular into Europe and Western Europe, and allowed for the freedom of countries such as Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Georgia, you name it, all of which we now call the CIS states. So I think when NATO started positioning Ukraine to be part of NATO and also started really intimidating the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, this sent a clear message to Russia that on its own border now they'll be faced with a possibility of a nuclear Ukraine and a very, very militarized Ukraine. And I think Putin, tried to have peace in Turkey, the peace agreement, and it's now well known that Boris Johnson, the UK Premier at the time, decided to pull Ukraine out of those peace talks. And I think what then happened is that the West, calculated that they would be able to inflict quite a serious military defeat on Russia, believing that the Russian military was not necessarily as strong as it has turned out to be. I think it took the Russians some time to get back the military. We mustn't forget that it was Russia that defeated Napoleon. It was Russia that defeated Hitler. And that led to eventually to the situation that we find ourselves in the world today.
It was also Russia that defeated the Swedes.
Absolutely. So the Russians are it's a formidable machine. And the Russian military has once again, I think, showed that they are truly capable of being able. But at the end of the day, as I mentioned in my discussions with President Putin, which were widely reported again, is that every war must end with peace, right? So rather have peace sooner than later. But there's no doubt, of course, that the Ukrainian situation is near collapse. The Ukrainian army, and I say this to many people. The West had stockpiled, a lot of old weaponry and tanks and all sorts of things in the bases, and they needed to use it so that they can be replenished and so that huge profits can be made by Western defense companies again. And I think that's exactly what's happened, There was
so the defense industry internationally are actually pushing for this war not to end.
Of course, if you look at the stock prices of the defense companies, in particular in the US, you will see that some of them have almost doubled in the space of the last few years, largely as a result of the super profits that are being made in the wars, not just in Ukraine, but also in the war, with Israel and the Middle East, as well as in the South China Seas. So the defense industry, the military-industrial complex that makes up a significant part of the U.S. and Western European economy has benefited enormously from these wars, as has always been the case in history. If you look at who benefits from the wars, it is often those that have the capital that benefit.
The rich families.
And just out of interest, what most people don't know, that the UK, for example, was indebted to the US for the Second World War, for the support that the US gave the UK in the Second World War. Only now, literally last year, I think it was last year, did the UK finally pay the amount owing to the US that they owed them for the Second World War.
Sure.
So wars leave huge debts. And Ukraine is a very wealthy country in terms of its agricultural exports, in terms of its minerals, etc., etc. So the Ukrainian people are going to be paying for this war to the West for the next 100 years. They will be doing that.
Yeah, so I think, but look, I mean, from my understanding was that President Putin and Russia simply did not want a NATO entity on its border. And Ukraine was applying to become that a member of NATO. So it will be interesting, well, it was interesting to see that even after all this time, NATO still didn't admit Ukraine into its ranks.
Yeah, I think that we mustn't forget that Russia is the largest country in the world. People forget that. By land mass, it is the largest country in the world by far, by the way. Most people, if you ask them which is the largest country in the world, they're not going to say Russia, but it is. Because it's the largest country in the world, it has exhaustive resources of oil, gas, forestry, oceans, the Arctic zone, for instance, is where there's significant findings, rare metals, you name it. And Russia only has a very small population relative to the size of the country.
Yeah.
So, there's always been an attempt to try and get your hands on Russia. And I think the neocons that exist in the United States and in the Western Europe saw this Ukraine opportunity to really get their hands on the massive amounts of resources that exist in Russia today. What they did not contend with was that under Putin, the Russian people were prepared to fight back. And we mustn't forget, Putin has practically dismantled the oligarchs that came to power during the time of Yeltsin. So, Putin was Boris Yeltsin's chosen successor. However, during the time of Boris Yeltsin, after Gorbachev, after the Soviet Union fell, many oligarchs, took the Russian wealth for themselves. Very similar to what's happening in South Africa today and in other countries today where, a few people that are politically connected are able to, amass significant wealth. What Putin did, in particular with Kardovsky, who was the wealthiest man in the world at one point in time, he decided that it's not acceptable that the Russian people do not benefit from the resources of Russia. And he dismantled about 100 oligarchs in Russia, including Kardovsky, and put him in jail at the time. And so Putin, if anything, is very committed to the Russian people. And just an interesting fact, not that it really matters that much, but almost, I would say almost all the oligarchs that became super oligarchs in Russia during the Yeltsin time were Jewish oligarchs. And the reason, people like, you might know Roman Abramovich, who owns Chelsea, who was not very important in Russia at the time of Yeltsin, but became important because banks such as JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs decided to back only certain people in Russia to acquire the Russian state-owned enterprises. And that's how they became the oligarchs, because when the Soviet Union fell apart, the Russian people were given shares in power companies, in oil companies, as ordinary workers, because they didn't have a very big income because of the Soviet Union. the Soviet state. And when that happened, their shares were, let's say, they were worth about $1,000 or let's say $10,000. Let's say $1,000. That was a lot of money for Russian people. And what banks like J.P. Morgan did and Goldman Sachs did, they then funded these mainly Jewish individuals. They weren't even entrepreneurs, to say, okay, we'll give you the money to buy the shares from the workers in these state-owned enterprises. So they offered these workers this, $1,000, let's say, for their shares. And the shares were actually worth $1 million each, just to give you an indication. So that's how they became the oligarchs. Yeah. And then most of them took their money out of Russia. Many of them took it to Switzerland.
So the funding came from Western countries?
Largely from J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs and Western institutions such as Credit Suisse at the time.
Doc, we're going to go on a quick break, but when I come back, we're going to talk about the arrest warrant that was issued against President Putin and whether that arrest warrant is even bothering President Putin at this point. And we are back with the Leadership Exchange. I've got with me Dr. Iqbal Survé, and we're talking about his trip to the BRICS conference in Kazan in Russia and his interaction with the President of Russia, President Putin. So, Doc, the whole issue of last year, President Putin was in the news all the time about this arrest warrant. Is this arrest warrant that was issued by the International Criminal Court even relevant at this point in time? Is it bothering President Putin still? Because it doesn't seem like it.
Look, President Putin addressed this particular point in his deliberations in Moscow before Kazan, when he said it doesn't bother him, first of all. Secondly, we mustn't forget that Russia, neither the United States, are signatories to the Rome Statute of the ICC. So as much as the ICC may have jurisdiction to those countries that are signatories, it has no jurisdiction over those countries that are not signatories. Ultimately, if you look at the ICC, they said they would investigate or charge Netanyahu, for example, and after enormous pressure from certain quarters, in particular the United States, they have still not, the prosecutor of the ICC has still not charged Netanyahu. So there's a lot of inconsistency, if you like, in terms of the ICC's prosecuting heads of state. And one gets the sense sometimes that the ICC is selective and biased and, open to influence in the way they do this. We mustn't forget that the reason that the ICC put forward for the prosecution of President Putin is that he had, at the time, according to them, removed a number of Ukrainian children that were involved on the war with Russia into safety in Russia itself, and they said there was a violation of the rights of the. Now, I think most observers would have said that's absurd, because at the end of the day, Russia was trying to safeguard the welfare of these.
It's called in local terms a trumped-up charge.
Yeah, very much so. I think I think we can. We live in a world of manufactured consent, as Chomsky says. We live in a world where people try and smear leaders in order to control the narrative, control judicial decisions, control economic decisions, control political decisions. And this is just part of, the overall strategy of the West to really isolate Russia and President Putin, that leads to the dismantling of Russia and access of, Western countries and capital to the vast resources of Russia. But also, the world has lived for almost, I would say, close on to 75 years or 70 years with a sort of single superpower. in the United States. And what's happened now is that increasingly there's a multipolar world coming to play, and increasingly even US think tanks are saying there is now, the leading multipolar countries are China, Russia, and the United States. So I think the US never wanted Russia to emerge as another superpower. I mean, there was the Cold War, and the US won the Cold War, let's be frank about it. And Russia was thought to be, consigned to the dustbins of history, except under Putin. If you look at the Gorbachev years, the Yeltsin years, Russia went into disarray. Under Putin, Russia has become strong again, and quite frankly, a superpower. And of course, China has emerged as a major power in the world. And whilst the West has tried to hold back China, they're 15 years too late. China has now really, is self-sufficient in terms of its needs, and increasingly becoming both from a global economic, political, and security standpoint as one of the superpowers in the world. So we're now heading towards a multipolar world. This is important for us in the global South, because when there's a multipolar world, these superpowers balance each other out, and there's no one particular power that if you disagree with, that power, they can either bomb the hell out of you or sanction the hell out of you or do those kind of things. So I think we must encourage a multipolar world and a multilateral institutions in that world.
Doc, so just on the final note, because we're now running quickly into 8 o'clock. What is the whole concept of BRICS? Is this where South Africa should be? Or do we still latch onto our, let's call it our Western values? I mean, this is now the global South. Is it time for the global South to rise now and be reckoned with? And is South Africa on the right path to be part of this global South family?
Look, I think it's not a choice. It's not an or. It's an and. So we can be both part of the Western economic systems, which is the market economy. We can have Western partners in our trading, in our businesses, whether they're US partners, whether they're German, whether they're French. But at the same time, we can also have Chinese, Russian, Brazilian, Indian, UAE, Saudi partners, for that matter, Iranian partners. So I don't think that we should be dictated to by who our friends must be, who we should do business with, who we should partner with economically, politically. We must have our own sovereignty, and that sovereignty is very much, which was established at the Bandung Conference. It established eventually the non-aligned movement. Of course, if there is a bias of South Africa, that bias should be towards Africa, because we are integral part, in particular sub-Saharan Africa. There's an opportunity, for sub-Saharan African countries to create a common monetary union, common economic policies, etc. And then, of course, we are part of the global South. All of us that have massive inequality within our countries, that require stimulus in order to reduce that inequality, overcome poverty, to create employment. These are the challenges that countries of the global South face. And so we have to work together because we have a common understanding. And we need to look at China. China took 900 million people out of poverty. The guys that just won the Nobel Prize for economics now, they used as their thesis case the fact that it is possible for state institutions that are well run, well managed, for example, to reduce poverty in a country as large as China. And so that's possible in the world today. So our future lies very much towards understanding what's happened in the global South and working together with both the West and the global South, because that's, our right. Our right is to befriend anybody. You don't only befriend those friends that people tell you must be friends with. We have a right to make our own decisions on who we want to do business with, partner with, and be friends with.
It reminds me now of Madiba's words, your enemies are not my enemies.
That's very correct. And Madiba, many people focus on the fact that Madiba sacrificed so much in his life and with his family, but the fact is that he was, a very wise person. And he was also someone that was courageous and someone that was very determined to speak the truth to power. And no matter if it was the US president or if it was, the president from another country, Madiba, and that's what we can learn. We must follow in that footstep of making sure that we stand for our country and African interests, and that we put our interests first. It's not about whether the interests are in the east or the west. It's a question of, does it improve the lives of our own people, and does it, create a better environment for our own people and the continent?
Doc, I'm running over time a bit, but it's fine because I got you here now, so that's a good thing. Doc, where we are now, I'm moving now away from international or geopolitics. Let's go a bit closer to home. We've had a little bit over 100 days of the GNU. What is your prognosis? Are we doing well in South Africa right now, or are we lagging? Or is the promises of the election happening? Is it something that's benefiting the ordinary South Africa? What is your prognosis of where we are now as South Africans?
There is no question that there is no real improvement in terms of the economic lives of the majority of South Africans. The only positive improvement, which is not a result of the GNU, is the fact that there's no load shedding. And that is because, quite frankly, Andre Reiter has been gotten rid of. And the black executives and engineers at Eskom were very competent, could do the jobs, because at the end of the day, Reiter was there simply to shut off the plants and to make sure that European capital and wealthy South African individuals benefit from the IPP program to the extent of almost 300 billion, right? So thank heavens for that we were able to fix the problem of Eskom. And I'm confident it will do well. Look, the GNU is not a GNU. Let's be clear about it. It is simply a partnership between the ANC and the DA. The person that said that so eloquently is Helen Zille herself. Just quite recently, publicly, she made the point that Ramaphosa only called it a GNU in order to be able to sell it to his own constituency. I'm all for all parties working together, because we must always respect our democracy, and if people work together, it's always better, provided that we have the same vision, we know where we want to go. But it's not possible for the ANC and the DA to be aligned in terms of the needs of the country's people. The DA's needs, the DA's people, its constituency is principally the establishment and big white capital, and the ANC's constituency is largely the poor, rural, urban working class of this country. And if you're going to tackle the problem of the poor, working class and rural, you need to have very different policies. The problem is that Ramaphosa is hostage to the Phala matter. The DA can at any point in time, recall Ramaphosa as president if they support the rest of the parties on a vote on Phala. And so Ramaphosa has to do everything that the DA wants him to do. So the effective situation, which is not good for democracy, is that a party that, has got 20% of the vote in the last election, the DA, effectively now controls the political and economic direction of the country. And as a case in point, you take the DA Minister of Home Affairs, Leon Schreiber, who went public and said he's signing an agreement with Ukraine for free visas for Ukrainians. On the other hand, Ramaphosa was in Russia saying that, Russia is an important ally of South Africa. Now, in any normal circumstances, if you're the president of a country and your minister goes against what you as a country have agreed to, which is to be part of BRICS, to be allied to Russia, you would fire the minister. Absolutely. There's no country in the world, no president in the world that would keep a minister like that in his cabinet. But Ramaphosa can't. Because if he does fire the minister, if he does fire any DA minister, if he does not do what the DA have said, then they will simply vote with the opposition to raise the Pala matter, and that has grave consequences.
But I thought the Pala matter has been concluded by the NPA.
No, well, I mean, there's the NPA has declined to prosecute, but that does not mean Ramaphosa cannot be impeached. There's a report by Justice Noble, who was the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court, you'll recall, that found that there was a prima facie case for Ramaphosa. But coming to the point, has the GNU benefited South Africans? That is the point. The answer is that there are no obvious economic indicators of benefit. For example, unemployment has not really decreased materially in the last while. There's been no real new jobs created. There certainly is no real foreign direct investment. Yes, the rand has strengthened slightly, but that really only benefits capital by and large. So there's no real benefit to ordinary people. So, from my point of view, my perspective, I've always believed that working together, no matter the political background, is important as long as you as the leading party are very clear that you are pro-poor, that you are pro-development, and that you stand, for social justice, for the majority of your people. We must always look at what's in the interest of those who cannot defend themselves, and those are the marginalized, and the poor in our society. And I think we must do everything possible to be able to help them. I don't believe that the GNU at its heart, wants to do that. I think it is there to really defend, large capital, big business, and frankly speaking, the establishment.
Doc, on that note, I think we must conclude. Doc, thank you very much for coming. I think you've enlightened us. You've given us a little bit of your experience in Russia, and especially with President Putin. And for that, we thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you once again for having me on the show.
And of course, Doc, hopefully we'll speak a little bit more about what's happening in the country soon.
Yeah, look forward to that.
So from our side, Doc, shukran very much, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
The Leadership Exchange. The Leadership Perspectives. Mondays, 7 to 8 p.m. Engaging with leaders who drive change. Exploring the minds shaping our world.